do this. You know, Joel Vavich was one of the most interesting men that I have known. And to quote a commercial, maybe he's the most interesting man in Brazoria County. But a super special man in so many ways. In so many ways that it's hard to put your finger on exactly what made him special, but he really was a special man. I had the privilege of being a colleague of his for 35 years, and it was a joy to work with him and beside him. And it's a joy to be able to say that he was a friend of mine, and that I was to be able to be a friend of his. I will say that he's a pretty quiet man, and kept to himself a lot, and it was hard to really figure out exactly who he was, because every time you try to start a conversation with him, first he's very quiet, but then he would kind of go off onto some story or some joke, and you could never quite get back to what you really wanted to find out. So developing a friendship was not easy, but we had a good relationship. And he's a man that was just humble. He had a gentle spirit, and many have described him as a sweet man. He loved that young man more than you can imagine. And Brendan, you're not disrupting this at all, so if you want to sit in the back, you can, but you don't have to. You know, as you saw on the slideshow, Joel loved his family first and foremost. Almost every one of those pictures included a family member. And he constantly talked about his kids and his grandchildren and had anecdotes about them when we did sit down and have an opportunity to talk. He was loved by his patients, and was loved by patients that are now 35, 40 years and older, still talk about their relationship with Dr. Bottenfield. And he was much appreciated by the parents and the families that he cared for. You know, he loved being a pediatrician, and in a great respect, his life was defined by his being a doctor. Almost everything he did was focused to be the best physician that he could be, to provide the best care that he could to his families that he cared for. And those of us that spent much time with Joel realized that he had superior intelligence, and probably had more medical knowledge than most of us put together. He surpassed us knowledge-wise, came up with the most esoteric information that we just couldn't figure out where it came from, but it came from this brain of his that was full of just high-powered information. It's just superior intelligence. And then, you know, in his later years, when he began to have some physical difficulties, it became more and more difficult for him to communicate well with his colleagues, with the staff at the hospital and in his office, and with his patients. But he could never quite give up the longing to practice medicine. He just couldn't give it up. He saw patients right up to the time when he just could not do it anymore. But even then, he kept coming to his office to stay connected, to just kind of mentor Aaron, to communicate with his families that he had taken care of, to sign the paperwork that needed to be signed. Almost right up to the end, he was at the office and wanted to be part of his continuing to be a pediatrician. Unfortunately, Joel did have some physical problems. I think in the mid-90s he developed MS. And like many physicians, he tended to neglect his own physical health in order to continue practicing medicine. And he probably should have sought more medical care than he did, but he just could not cut himself away from his patients. And even when he did take a little hiatus, as soon as he came back, he was going at 100% to get back into providing care for his patients and families. um, he overworked himself, basically, in spite of his physical concerns. And, he worked in 2 hospitals covering pediatrics and nursery. He worked in an emergency room. He just worked all the time, even when he physically probably should have been paying more attention to himself. So I have just a few things that came to my mind about Joel. We've had all those pretty things that we've read in the obituary, but there are some things that maybe were kind of more interesting. Joel spent the last number of years wearing cargo pants. I mean, everywhere he went, he wore cargo pants, and every pocket was full of something. So he would be walking around like this with pockets full of papers and candy and medical stuff that he needed. And he always had a jacket on also. It didn't matter whether it was 110 degrees outside, he was wearing a jacket. Just one of those things that sticks in your mind. And then he had this Suburban. If you looked in that Suburban, you would think Joel lived in that Suburban. And in fact, some of us thought he did. He had a whole rack of clothes. He had dirty laundry. He had his sports equipment. He had food. He had everything he needed to live in that Suburban. It was unbelievable. In fact, one of the physicians that, who I won't mention, just kept asking me, where actually does Joel live? Because it looks like he lives in that Suburban. Well, we just never knew, and we still don't where he lived during those times. And then Joel was famous for stories and jokes. You could almost not have a conversation with him without him starting off on some story. The problem was that by the time he was done, you were scratching your head trying to figure out what was he really trying to tell us. Some of them made sense, but most of them we just never quite figured out what they were. But he was famous for those. And like I said, it was difficult to have a serious conversation because he was always interjecting a joke of some kind. He's a man that seemed never to sleep, but always seemed to be sleeping. Now, that doesn't make a lot of sense, but he would be making rounds in the nursery at 11, 12 o'clock at night, having the nurses get the kids ready for circumcisions at 12 o'clock at night. He would be dictating charts in the middle of the night. He would be wandering around the halls of the hospital in the middle of the night. But then sometimes you would find him slumped over in the doctor's lounge in a deep, deep sleep. He could just sit down and go to sleep, boom. And when he went to sleep, there was no waking him. In fact, I remember in our office sometimes he would go in his office at the clinic, and like one of those pictures, he was all slumped in his chair and be dead away in sleep. And the nurses would be banging the doors, trying to wake him up, throwing things on his desk, which you couldn't see, by the way, and they just could not wake him up. So he was up all hours of the night, but he seemed to be sleeping all the time too. He was great at being able to do that, and somehow kept his energy level up in spite of this erratic sleep behavior that he had. In the last few years, Joel had a little problem verbally communicating. It was almost like there was he was communicating, but it was so quiet it almost seemed like a mumbling. And it was very difficult to understand what he was saying. And he was always looking at things like this with his glasses. I don't know why he wore his glasses, but anyway, he was always looking like this when he was checking things out. But I can remember often when he was at the house, he would be trying to tell a story, and my wife would say, Joel, you've got to speak up. We can't understand what you're saying. And he would speak up for a few seconds and then go back to his, and we just have to pretend we understood what he was saying. He spent so many hours at the hospital that I think hospital administration finally told him, Joel, you can't live at the hospital. I don't know if that's true, Al, but that's the rumor that I heard. And then there was this business about his office in the clinic. You could walk into his office and there was not anywhere on the floor where there wasn't papers, stacks of journals, charts. His desk was stacked 2-3 feet high with paperwork. Every drawer was stuffed full. The bookcase was covered with all kinds of random papers and things. He kind of hoarded everything that there was. And you'd look through that stuff. After he moved to another office, we were looking through them. There was like 10-year-old things stacked up in his office. He would be hiding behind those things, sleeping most of the time. And between patients, the nurses would have to go wake him up and get him to go see patients. It was like, where's Waldo when you go into his office? And then just 2 little anecdotes. He was a borrower. At least for me he was. Many, many times he would come to me and say, Jerry, I need to borrow your truck. David's moving some stuff and I got to have a truck to do that. And I'd say, okay, Joel, you can borrow the truck. And then sometimes he'd come and say, my car broke down, I got to take it in and I need your truck. And I'd say, fine, you can have my truck. And about a week or 10 days later, I'd say, Joel, where's my truck? Oh, I haven't taken the car in yet to get it fixed. So, and then about a week later, he'd say, well, David's going to drop off the truck. And then another week later, the truck would finally show up my truck. So that was the truck. Well, then there was the bicycle. There was a time in Joel's life where he said, I need to get some exercise. He knew I had some extra bicycles, as Bruce and Tom know. They probably have just as many in their garage. I said, Joel, I'll loan you a bicycle, but just remember, it's just a loan. Well, 3 years later, I asked him, Joel, do you think I could get the bike back? I really like that bike. I'd like to start riding it. He said, okay. Well, 2 or 3 weeks later, I asked him again, well, okay, I'll get it back to you. Because sometimes I'd see that bicycle in the back of a Suburban. And then finally, I called him and I said, well, Joel, I really need it back in a couple of weeks. He said, did that bicycle have a seat on it when you gave it? Well, I got the bike back, but there was no seat. Anyway, that's kind of the way Joel was, just a special guy. And then just lastly, I wanted to share something that to Joel and to many of us was a watershed moment in his life. And he shared with me one night that he was in the doctor's lounge dictating patient records. And he was overwhelmed by a sense of loneliness and separation from God. And he just broke down right there in the doctor's lounge all by himself and asked Jesus to come into his life and be real as a Savior and Lord. From that point on, Joel practiced a very quiet faith, but it was a deep faith that he believed. And he would spend many Sunday afternoons, he would go play tennis, but on his way home he would stop at Buc-ee's and buy some candy and cookies and come to our house for a Bible study. And he very rarely missed that unless he was on call or working at the hospital. He just practiced that faith in a quiet way. But every opportunity that he had to share with others the peace that he experienced with his relationship with Jesus, he shared that. And he wasn't embarrassed about sharing that. It just made him a stronger man because he put his faith in the one that can answer our needs and give us peace and joy in life. And he's experiencing that joy to no end right now. I just count it a privilege to have been able to know Joel, to be called a friend by Joel. He was a special, one-of-a-kind man, and he'll be missed by all of us.